Yep.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amelia Bagwell. I am a graduate student here at University of West Georgia, where, of course, our orientation in this department is that of a humanistic model. So we are not what would be considered a traditional medical model of psychology. And so today I've prepared a talk that I've titled Humanism and Cognitive Science, Heeding Husserl, a Case for Cognitive Science. And I know that people who know me well would say, how, Amelia, can you do this? Because of how deeply and emotionally I am involved in the cause of humanistic psychology. It is exactly the reason that I'm at West Georgia. But it is the commitment to this orientation that, in fact, inspired me to want to talk about this, because in order for humanistic psychology to continue, we have to keep it true to the concept of holism, and we also have to keep it alive through relevance. And holism requires humanistic psychology not to discount or to disregard the work of the medical model of psychology or of science. It is a part of our world, and holism embraces that. It and also, especially with a phenomenological orientation, which humanistic psychology has a basis in, what can be revealed through the medical model is very important, because as we look for truths or truth to reveal itself, this paradoxal, if you will, versus dichotomy of relationships can actually reveal truths that enlarge and expand our understanding of the human being. And so it is from that perspective that I wanted to undertake this conversation. And cognitive psychology is specifically relevant to this because they deal with aspects of function of mind. And sometimes you can discuss that vis-a-vis consciousness or other aspects that we talk about in foundations of humanistic psychology. But when you start trying to figure out what makes the human being work, then that is something that is a powerful and magnificent thing for. In fact, I think it's at the core, it's the taproot of what we do in psychology as a human science. Now, from the perspective of relevance, we do have to see that we are outliers in the psychological community. And that kind of requires us to reach out to the traditional method of science as opposed to pull back in. It's understandable that, and I think we've heard this reflected once in a while, that it's almost like an us versus them as opposed to an us and them. And no different than Edmund Husserl, who I've kind of will be basing this presentation on. He went forth to the scientific community when he had his address, The Crisis of European Science, in the 1930s. He never said that there was anything wrong with science. What he was trying to do with that science was to remind them that there was meaning to what they were doing, that they were in a world that they couldn't be distinct from their experience. And so he never, ever disavowed scientific discoveries that were based on empirical information that had validity, reproducibility. He had nothing against the community of science at all, any more than we should as we continue forth in our psychological learnings. There's nothing wrong with the medical model. It does bring forth a lot of things that are important for us to know. But the place where humanistic psychology becomes irrelevant is to say, but what you know has to have a meaning. And that's kind of what I really believe that Husserl was trying to do. So what I wanted to do was illuminate specifically a few key areas where the cognitive psychology, the science of cognitive psychology is germane for building a bridge between what we call psychology as a human science and the dominant paradigm of the natural science method that I think is not going to be so hard to do. So one of the things that I wanted to do first was to talk about some of the similarities that we have. And one of the things that and I'm not going to be talking too much about this, humanistic psychology is deeply entrenched in philosophical origins, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Well, as it turns out, so is cognitive psychology. One of the very, very first things that Plato talked about was that his belief that the brain was the center of mental processes. And that is kind of a taproot of cognitive science or cognitive psychology. So no different than humanistic psychology can trace its origins back to the Greek thing or this Greek concept of the good life or the whole life. Plato also was able to begin the discussion about how is it that the mind works? How do we know what we know? How do we think what we think? Where do we think what we think? It's easy to take that question for granted right now because, I mean, we're in the 21st century. We've got a computer at our hands in the moment. We don't even have to, it's second nature. It's the air we breathe. But this was a big deal back in 430 BCE. And so, I'm not going to give you the whole history of philosophy and psychology here. There's a really good instructor I know that teaches that course that I would highly encourage. But let's switch over to the Common Era. And so Galen, he talked about sensory info and motor control. And so he was picking up that question, how is it that we know what we know? How does the sensorial knowledge of experience, I touch something and know that I've touched it? And he took up that cause. And so he certainly would be considered a philosopher, and no different, again, than humanistic psychology, where we have our whole pantheon of philosophical gods and goddesses, if you will. But so then we're going to kind of go forth to Descartes. And as you have amply stated, we are, whether we choose our father or not, children of Descartes. And I really liked how you put that, because no different than being actual children of parents, our parents may give us things that are good and bad simultaneously. And of course, Descartes brought forth, I think, therefore I am, which is kind of, again, at the heart of the cognitive process. I think, therefore I am. And so I'm going to kind of swap it, bring it into modern era just a little bit. All of these things started to be able to be empirically proven. By the sitting and working with stroke victims, Wernicke and Broca were able to find the language centers of the brain where speech and language originate from. Now, that is verifiable, it's empirically proven, and there is absolutely no way that any of us sitting around this table or anyone listening to this message going, but I'm a humanistic psychology, that reduces the human. No, that opens up the human. Where humanistic psychology can join hands with cognitive psychology is, while you may know where the language centers originate from in the brain, humanistic psychology can speak to the two people, one in the hospital bed and the other holding the hand, listening to see if speech was maintained after that stroke occurred, because that's where the meaning comes in. But unless we know that those areas of the brain may or may not have been damaged in the first place, how can we bring meaning to it? So this is where the two different disciplines, orientations, can kind of come together and work together to broaden and fulfill one another's purpose. So as we continue in our little march to mondarity, like humanistic psychology, cognitive psychology kind of rose out from pure behaviorism. There was a deficit that was seen with the stimulus response. And in 1948, Tolman did some really interesting experiments with lab rats, imagine lab rats and experiments. But what he recognized is that there's a pause, there's a difference. They don't just stimulus response. They made little cognitive maps. They had their own little world. There was something going on called latent learning, because based on their experience, they knew how to maneuver through these otherwise strictly stimulus response behavioristic techniques without reinforcement. Thank you, yes. And so they did it from an intrinsic motivation and also from what they were able to figure out. Now, I have a special aversion to rats, and so I'm not necessarily one that's going to champion the cause of the rat, but I will champion the cause of those rats, because this was at a time when behaviorism was the primary paradigm to understand humans and their behavior. And this was the spark that said, wait a minute, there's something else. Well, humanistic psychology was doing the same thing. It's like, wait a minute, there's something else. We are not reduced to these machines that just have a stimulus given and a response to it, even if it's conditioned or not conditioned. And I think when you recognize that both of these things kind of came out from a reductivist approach to humans as people, as experiential based organisms, then again, that's another bridge between these two disciplines and two orientations. And it gave space to the relational condition of rat or self and world back to self. And without going too deep into phenomenological ideas, this relation between world and self and world and other is it's one of the cores of the foundations of existentialism, which helped to give rise to humanistic psychology. Now, where some things kind of took a shift for me when talking about cognitive science, cognitive psychology in particular, between the 1950s and the 1980s with the advent of computers, that this became kind of a model for the working of the mind. And it's pretty easy to consider this, that you get input in, it goes into the mind, and it gets stored in memory, and things go where they're supposed to go, and providing your computer is not mine, it will work appropriately. You can bring these files up. And I think that this is maybe where I might kind of pull back a little bit from that. Yes, we do experience world through senses, and Husserl would not disagree with that. He would disagree with the fact that there was a separation between what the experience and the experiencer. There is no separation with Husserl's version of phenomenology, and certainly as phenomenology, the discipline itself grew, that that gets even more. And I'll stop there with that. But I do want to kind of talk about some specific areas and to shift to 3 topics that I think we can bring about a salient conversation on humanistic psychology and cognitive psychology in specific. And there's kind of going to be a compare and contrast, and I don't want to dominate this, but if you've got a question, I'll try to answer them at the end if that's okay with everybody, but if anybody hears something and you just have to jump in. But I wanted to talk about metacognition, perception, and memory. And I'm going to stick strictly to Husserlian phenomenology here, and then just kind of tie in some humanistic ideas that were born from that. But because my talk is specific to Husserl, I just am staying specific to Husserl. I'm also going to, if I start saying words that have lots of hyphens in them, no, that's Heidegger, never mind. Okay, I guess that's only funny to, anyway. I'm going to start with metacognition, and basically what metacognition is thinking about thinking. I mean, that's a simple way to put it. It's beyond thinking. So metacognition in cognitive psychology is you as the person being able to examine the processes of your mind. What am I thinking about? That's a big deal, actually, if you think about it. I doubt that my bird at home that I love beyond measure sits and says, what am I thinking about? Why am I thinking about it? How am I thinking about it? But we get to do that. That's a really enormous privilege and burden all at the same time. Now, humanistic psychology is going to take this and open that up in a whole different way. Not only can we think about what we are thinking of, we are the being that can think of what we're thinking of. And where that does have more roots in Heideggerian concepts, Husserl kind of started this when he started his task of phenomenology, talking about intentionality, that anytime we're thinking about something, if there's a direct action where it's going. If you think about somebody that pulls an arrow back and they let it go, there's a target. And so anything that if we're thinking a thought, not only are we the thinker thinking the thought, but there's an intention. It's called intentionality. In other words, consciousness is consciousness of. There is no separation of this subject and object between the two. And so for me, with metacognition, the way that it's taken up by cognitive psychology, it could seem that consciousness is being put in a box or being separated. But I would think that actually Husserl has some structures of consciousness that would be very particular and very germane to taking up this task, which I think would lend itself better to discussion than to try to go into it all now. But Husserl did take up the task of looking at how we think, what makes us think the things that we do, and that he talks about having consciousness of intentional acts, of intentional objects, or intentional interpretations. It's the same intention, but it's just different aspects of it. And I would suggest that metacognition kind of falls into that category. It's the same human brain that we're pondering. It's just different aspects of the whole person that's doing the pondering. And so as we kind of go on a little bit further with this, the next thing that I really want to talk about is perception. And before I do that, I did want to just kind of say one of the definitions that I remember from my Intro to Psych book when talking about cognitive psychology, and that it was to learn these mental processes as they affect behavior and can be scientifically studied. And I think metacognition doesn't necessarily fall into that realm quite as easy. That's a kind of an abstract concept, but with the concept with perception and memory, I do think that there are some very relevant studies that have come forth out of cognitive psychology that not only show you can study it, which again emphasizes its importance, but then how humanistic psychology can take those findings and bring them alive in a real experiential and meaningful way. So these mental processes, again, as I said, would always be about something, and that there are structures to them. So keeping that in mind, and we'll kind of move to the area of perception. And both humanistic psychology and cognitive psychology share the notion that it's sensory input, if you want to use the word, I'll borrow that, that gives us, it's the experience that gives us whatever it is up here that makes our brains work and gives us the beings that we are. Now, cognitive psychology is going to draw from very early pioneers, Wilhelm Wundt, Titchener, and they provide structures, much the same way as I say that Husserl provided structures of consciousness, but they provided structures to analyze. In fact, that was a whole form of psychology for a while during the history of psychology. But humanistic psychology is going to take this question of perception and put it on the emphasis on individual interpretation and of the perceived item, whereas the cognitive model is going to study how you perceive what you perceive and measure and take quantitative data. Humanistic psychology is going to take that and turn it into qualitative data. And so it's, again, I'm going to go back to Husserl, where he says, in perception, something is perceived. And then in imagination, something is imagined. In a statement, something is stated. In love, something is loved, etc. And so whereas cognitive psychology is taking perception up in a way that is input and output, humanistic psychology takes it up in a way that says there's a reason that we're doing it. But both are relevant at the same time, because we have to know something about what we're perceiving, how we're perceiving, where it's going in the structures of the mind. Because how else would we know if something is amiss? There is no way to talk to the whole human or to treat the whole human, especially from a clinical perspective, if you don't know that something may be wrong. There is a standard that needs to be set and met, and this is where reliability, testability, and validity comes in, and this is cognitive psychology's contribution to that. But the big area that I really wanted to focus on was memory, because cognitive psychology has made tremendous contributions to the understanding of memory. And the way that I knew I wanted to talk about memory is because my very first moment that I stepped into an Intro to Psych course in my very first semester at a 2-year college, my teacher, who was a self-ascribed cognitive behavioral therapist and taught from that perspective, was talking about how we remember things. And I remember very well that we started on chapter 2. And I remember why she said that she wanted to do it. And she started talking about the serial position effect. She said, I'm going to teach you how you can retain knowledge. I'm going to teach you how you remember things. That way, when you take a test, you're going to know how to study. So the very first thing you're going to learn in my classroom is how your mind remembers things. And I just thought that was incredible. And it actually worked. And so from her, I learned about studies where Murdoch in 1962 started talking about how if you give a list of words, that the first and the last, or the primary and the last, if you want to go the recency, are going to be the ones that you remember the most. The ones in the middle, not so much. And then you have Atkinson and Schiffman in 1968, and they really add to that, and that's when they give it the name of the serial position effect. And they talk about rehearsal and things that you can do. They really expand on short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory, and how things get encoded in the brain. And then later you have the Badley and Hitch model, which people know as the 7 plus minus 2. So basically, if you give 9 things for people to remember, most people in average can remember 7 plus or minus 2. So this is incredible and very useful and absolutely verifiable. And this is a huge contribution that cognitive science and cognitive psychology has made, in particular, to human beings. And I'm going to go back to the stroke victim just for a minute, and I'm going to make this a little bit personal. My daughter had a stroke 2 weeks ago, a mini stroke. And I was the one sitting beside her bed as they were doing some of these basic neurological tests to see where she was with her brain function. I am grateful beyond measure that somebody took the time to research and study this. But where humanistic psychology comes in is I know what it meant. I was the mother sitting beside her daughter, looking and waiting with anticipation and held breath. Can you remember? And so had it not been for these pioneers of cognitive science that gave us these measurable and valid tests, I wouldn't have been able to sit and make that meaning with her. There wouldn't be a way to know what was the damage or not in our case, thankfully. And also with the plus, and this is again where I want to bring in humanistic psychology in particular. I've reared 9 children in my life. I promise you, if you give me the names of those 9 children, there won't be any plus or minus. I would be able to tell you because those names have meaning for me. So this is where humanistic psychology and cognitive psychology do need to come together, because cognitive psychology can't just base itself on the facts and the figures of these tests. If you do that, they become sterile and vapid. But if you recognize that the names that you may be saying, or even the way you may be saying it, or even the way you're sitting in your chair, could be the difference between someone being able to have a memory of plus or minus 2 on those 7s, then this is where our 2 disciplines can co-create something really spectacular for the humans that we're working with and trying to improve the life of. Now, Husserl in particular, I just absolutely, when it comes to memory, love Husserl. Time-space consciousness was one of my favorite parts of phenomenology, and I wrote volumes about it while I was in that class. I'm not going to read all of what I wrote, but he introduced the concept of memory in a really exciting way. And he talked about retention and recollection. And he also further kind of pulled it back. And both of those are unique aspects of memory. And but within this was something called the subjectivity of time. And so what he's saying is that retention is part of an ever-expanding now. In other words, this is a memory that's ongoing. And the best way that he described it was a musical note. And I'm not going to go into the depth of that, but if I were to start singing, Mary had a lit, every single one of you just finished the song, because that was not a process of memory. That was a recollection of an entire unified experience of that song. Oh my gosh, that's just got recorded of me singing. Okay, if American Idol calls, y'all, I'm sorry, but there isn't an active recall. In other words, your mind is not necessarily producing this memory out of a storage facility somewhere in its brain. What it is an entire expansion of a whole unified memory and experience. And so I really think that that's kind of exciting, that cognitive science can give us these ideas of where they may be located in the brain, but phenomenology and humanistic science can tell us that it's a unified experience. And I just, for me, that was really powerful. But probably closer to how cognitive science takes up the idea of memory is recollection and what he calls secondary memory. And it's a distinct memory from the primary retention. And this is where your brain has the possibility of rearranging items in a specific manner. It can be, and it kind of takes on how cognitive sciences talk about episodic memory. Wait a minute. Okay, there's 3 of them. Did I write them down? I probably didn't write them down. Well, let's see if I can remember the 3. So there's episodic, there's
declarative,
declarative,
procedural.
Thank you. See, I should know you would know that. Thank you. I don't have to recall how to tie my shoe. It's there. It's there. I don't have to try to pull that out of anywhere. It is just part of the whole. Now, but I do have a very specific memory of the first time I was kissed. Well, that's an episodic memory. And Husserl talks about that when he brings up his concept of recollection. That's a different type of memory than having I don't have to think about driving, I don't have to think about tying my shoe, I don't have to think about my ABCs anymore, except for when I'm down in special collections. But it's a place where the two worlds, I think, again, can cross over and bridge. But where I think humanistic psychology takes it up, even from Husserl, and gives more meaning to it, actually happened to me today in class. And I'm going to actually read something straight from Poet, where he talks about memory. And it's Rilke. And he says, for the memories themselves are not important, only when they have changed into our very blood, into a glance and a gesture, and are nameless, no longer to be distinguished from ourselves. Only then it can happen that in some way, in some very rare hour, the first word of a poem arises in their midst and go forth from them. And this takes memory to a different level. This takes memory to the area of meaning. So while cognitive science can tell us what we remember, how long we're going to remember it, and possibly even where in the brain it's stored, humanistic psychology, based upon phenomenological taproot, can give meaning to those memories. And again, where the two can come together to co-create something entirely wonderful and unique. And for me, that is the spirit of this particular presentation. That it is helpful to recognize how mind structures raw sensory data, and to know what parts of the brain may or may not control and coordinate different functions. And that's relevant in all areas of psychology. If someone is in a PTSD episode, time ceases to mean the same thing when you're not. Or if you're severely depressed, if you're schizophrenic. There are many areas where having the ability to know whether or not someone is remembering something. Do you remember what your name is? If I repeat this, can you repeat it back to me? If someone has had a stroke, if someone's had a traumatic brain injury. And these are all relevant to the specific discipline of psychology. And had it not been for cognitive science, we would not know, we wouldn't have a standard by which to measure. We do need a standard by which to measure, quote, normal, bell curve. It exists for a reason. But where I feel that has the paradigm, the dominant paradigm, still no different than when Husserl stood in Europe in the 1930s and says, but you forgot to tell them why. You may have said what, you may have said how, but you forgot to say why. And that is the call of humanistic psychology. And the only way that call is going to be heard is if, instead of pushing back against these disciplines and pushing back against this knowledge and pushing away from the medical model, that instead we open our arms and say, give us every bit of knowledge, every bit of verifiable data that you have. Let us take your quantitative, statistically relevant measures and let us provide the meaning, and never in any moment think that the statistics can replace the person who's going through the experience of them. Because at the end of the day, the 7 plus or minus 2 does not matter. What matters is the person who is or not able to repeat them. What matters is the life world that they inhabit that is already laden with meaning. And if you forget the meaning that could be in those words or those numbers or the serial positioning and fit, then cognitive science has failed the humans that they seek to serve. If humanistic psychology only says that it matters by meaning only, well, okay, you babbled three things back to me, but you did it with a lot of emotion and heart, so yay, you're fine, then humanistic psychology loses its relevance in the modern world. And so at the end of the day, try to remember that even raw sensory data presents itself differently to each of us. Right now, I imagine some of you are very comfortable in this room. Some of you are cold. Some of you may be hot. Some of you, the lighting is great. Some of us, not so much. So even the raw sensory perceptions and data that cognitive psychology is built on still always has to be measured within the context of the human being. And so with that, kind of concludes the main parts that I wanted to talk about, but just to remember, and I love the title of this, but it's not just humanistic psychology, it's psychology as a human science. And so it is a science. It's one based on what can't be measured, what is ineffable, what cannot be easily named, but it is science. And phenomenological methodology can give us ways to put these into meaning units if we wanted to do qualitative data analysis. So it is possible to do test and to continue on. But the purpose today was to see if we could build a bridge between these two worlds, and I hope with the three areas that I brought up that maybe I did. And with that, I think I'll conclude my part of it and open up for questions and discussion.